44, the scripture says, "And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way." I want to start off by saying that I believe it is pretty much universally accepted that crucifixion was not a pleasant experience. I don't think there's too many people out there in the world who would argue that point. I don't think there are too many people out there in the world who, if they were to choose the way in which they were going to die, would say, "Hey, I think I'll be crucified." That is not pleasant. It's probably way up there on the list with burning and, I don't know, maybe one or two others, being sawn in two, boiled in oil, those kinds of things. These are torturous deaths. They're not just something that's designed to take your life. They're something that's designed to take your life over a period of time in an extremely uncomfortable way. And so I think pretty much everybody would universally accept that idea that crucifixion wasn't pleasant. So I find it absolutely astonishing when I read this verse. "And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him." I find it astonishing that these two guys who were on a cross concurrently with Jesus, suffering that torturous death, felt the need, or had the energy for that matter, to revile Jesus. But that is exactly what we are told in this verse, is that these two men who were being crucified had such a negative attitude toward Jesus that while they were being crucified, they also were reviling him. And it tells us something about these two men. And something more than just their attitudes. It talks about their priorities. It talks about their arrogance. Even though they were crucified with him, being put to death by the state, they still viewed themselves as better than that guy who was between them. They were being put to death for their thieving ways, but still felt justified in criticizing Jesus. Why are we told about these men? It's not essential in the sense that it has anything to do with our salvation. Jesus dying on the cross is what was required for propitiation to be made for sins, and that's clearly the focus of the record. And yet we're still told about these two other guys, and we're told what they were, and we're told here in Matthew 27:44 that they joined in the criticism against Jesus that was going on. Why are we told about these men? What is there for us to learn from them? I think that's an important question. They're not there just to dress up the story. We're told about them so that we can learn from them. Now, what I want to do is turn to Luke's account of the crucifixion now and start reading in verse 20 of chapter 23 of the book of Luke. And among the other things that we notice in this reading, I want you to notice that there were, in fact, two robbers that were crucified with him. It says, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus. And so here are all these Jews. They brought Jesus here before Pilate. They're demanding that he be crucified. Pilate wants to let him go. And so he goes out to the crowd once again and starts talking to them. And it says they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And a third time he says to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish him and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted, and he released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, that's Barabbas, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting for him. But turning to them, Jesus said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. So it's very, very, very pointed that there are two of them. It's very, very pointed that they were criminals. It's very, very pointed that they were on either side of him. And then, of course, I want to remind you of where we started in this from Matthew 27, that when these events were taking place, they were led, they were put on the cross, the three men are hanging on the cross. Matthew tells us that they also reviled him in the same manner that the crowds were reviling him. And so then we pick up with Luke's reading in verse 34. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They cast lots to divide his garments. The people stood by watching, but the ruler scoffed at him, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself, if he's the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked. So we've got the rulers, we've got the soldiers, we've got the criminals who were crucified with him, all mocking him. The soldiers also mocked, coming up and offering sour wine and saying, If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the king of the Jews. And then it says in verse 39, one of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. And so what's taking place here is it starts off with both of them railing against him. And now as time has progressed and things have happened, it's now only one of them that continues to rail at him. But the other, it says in verse 40, rebuked him, that is the other criminal, saying, Do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we're receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So often we hear about the thief on the cross. But there were two of them. And to understand what's being taught here, you have to pay attention to both of these men and to what took place and to what they did. We make a terrible mistake when we focus only on one and then start trying to make application of this teaching, because they're not presented as one. It's over and over pointed out that there are two of them. It's over and over pointed out that they did something together. It's then pointed out together that there is a shift between one and the other. And in order to understand, we have to consider both of these people. And we start off being told, or observing, I guess at this point, that they both were blameworthy. These were guilty men. And that's by their own admission. We indeed justly. We're under this condemnation justly. We are receiving the due reward of our deeds. They were blameworthy. They were worthy of death. And this guilty man admits that. Now, they're identified as robbers in the text. A robber is a thief who uses force in order to take things, or at least threats force. And so a robber is someone who comes up and hits you on the head and then takes your wallet, as opposed to a thief who just may take something that belongs to you. There's this concept of violence connected with it. And so if that's what they were, then we're talking about really bad guys who used physical force to take things from other people. But I want you to know that the word that's translated robber here actually can also be translated insurrectionist. And so it's really possible that they're on the cross for insurrection. In fact, it seems much more likely to me, because guess why Jesus was ultimately on the cross? From a Roman standpoint, that's the charge against him as well. And so, more than likely, that's what they were. But whatever it was that their crime was, what is made clear in the Bible is that they both were criminals and they were actually worthy of being executed. It was a just thing that was happening to them. Now, when we look at these two guys and we look at the description in this story, what we realize is that these two men heard the exact same things on that day as one another. They heard the crowds, they heard the soldiers, they heard the charge, they heard everything that they experienced in terms of what they heard and the things that were said was exactly the same. They both were condemned. They both were marched out there. They both were nailed to the cross. They listened to the crowds. They listened to the rulers. They listened to the soldiers. They heard the words of Jesus from the cross. They both heard exactly the same thing. And they also both saw exactly the same things. From the same perspective. They saw all of the identical things, and the crowds and the people and they saw it. They saw Jesus, who, by the way, had been mistreated even more than them, because before he even got to the cross, he had been severely beaten and abused. And they saw that. I want to notice it and kind of get a feel for the things that they heard and saw. And so the best way to do that, I think, is to go to the 22nd Psalm, which is a really good record. None of the gospel writers go into a lot of detail about what's going on, and particularly about how it's affecting the Lord. But the psalmist does in the 22nd Psalm. So we start reading in Psalm 22. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? You might recognize those words. Those are the first words that he uttered from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? My God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted, they trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. You might recognize those words too. We just read them in Luke's account as what the people around Jesus were saying. Yet you're he who took me from the womb. You made me trust at my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Be not far from me, for trouble is near. There is none to help. Many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. And I just want to add, I think this poured out by water is kind of an idiom. And it's not just saying, I poured out, we might have a glass of water and take a drink of it, and there's some, and we just toss it to the side. It's not even just, I don't think, an image of that as much as the idea of water that's used and that has no value anymore and isn't good for anything being cast out intentionally. He says, I am poured out by water, like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It's melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They've pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That's what these men saw and heard. That they saw a man mistreated and abused and mocked and railed against. They saw a man beaten. They saw a man crucified. They saw a man in agony. And they saw a man whose heart was melting away. Both these men heard and saw, witnessed all of these events, and were told about them so that we recognize that they react very differently. Starting from the exact same attitude. They both were arrogant men who railed against Jesus. They both were robbers or insurrectionists who abused other people for their own desires. That's where they both started. The exact same attitude, and they experienced the exact same things that day. They had both gone through trials. They had both been condemned. They had both been crucified. They heard the exact same words spoken by the crowds, spoken by the passersby, spoken by the soldiers, spoken by the Jewish rulers. They witnessed the exact same incredible circumstances. And if we read Matthew's account, we find out about the sun being darkened, and in the middle of the day, there's no light on the earth, and the earthquakes and the other things that surrounded these events that were just amazing. And they both witnessed these incredible circumstances. They both outlived Jesus, by the way. You'll recall when they came out to check on them, they broke the legs of these two robbers. They weren't dead yet. They didn't do that with Jesus because he was dead already. So they both outlived Jesus to see all of these circumstances that surrounded his crucifixion. And they react in polar opposite ways. One of them realized the truth about Jesus. Realized that Jesus was an innocent man. Realized that Jesus had done nothing wrong. Realized that Jesus was something special and came to faith. And I say that because he asks of Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He understood that Jesus was in fact a king. Not in the way that he was accused. He understood that Jesus was in fact coming into a kingdom. He understood that Jesus actually had the power to help him. He understood that even though Jesus was on a cross dying, he could still do something for him. He came to faith. He came to believe. in the claims. And he said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. The other one, he continued to rail against Jesus, to criticize him, to abuse him, to hurl insults at him. These two can be seen as representative of any individual, anywhere, of all individuals, collectively, and what we can do when we are confronted by Jesus and his cross in the gospel. Look, it's the same story. It's the same gospel that was preached in Jerusalem on Pentecost after the resurrection. The gospel hasn't changed. It's been preached for over 2,000 years. And when the story is preached, and we learn about this man, and we learn about what he taught, and we learn about what he did, and we learn about what was done to him, and we learn about him being handed over to men and being killed, and after him being killed, him rising again on the third day, we can either come to recognize the truth about him and recognize that he is able to deliver us, or we can choose to continue to rail, to complain, to question, to doubt. Or what's implied here is to believe that not only is he no better than me, but that he's worthy of my criticism, so I'm better than him. What this story is about, what these robbers are about, is asking the question, what am I going to do with Jesus? Because these two men in the exact same circumstances, coming from the exact same place, the exact same history, the exact same attitudes, everything about them was the same, did something different from one another. So, what am I going to do? Which one am I going to look like? Will I acknowledge my guilt? Will I acknowledge his kingship and place my hope in him? Or will I reject the gospel of salvation and rail against God? I want to leave you this morning with actually the words of a hymn that was written back in 1905 by a man named Albert Simpson. It's an especially powerful hymn. Jesus is standing in Pilate's hall, friendless, forsaken, betrayed by all. Hearken, what meaneth the sudden call? What will you do with Jesus? Jesus is standing on trial still. You can be false to him if you will. You can be faithful through good or ill. What will you do with Jesus? Will you evade him as Pilate tried? Or will you choose him, whate'er betide? Vainly you struggle from him to hide. What will you do with Jesus? Jesus, I give thee my heart today. Jesus, I'll follow thee all the way, gladly obeying them, will you say? This will I do with Jesus. What will you do with Jesus? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, what will he do with me? I would submit to you that the thief on the cross that we hear so much about, what we need to learn from him is to acknowledge our guilt, to acknowledge Jesus' kingship, to acknowledge his kingdom, and to realize that the only hope we have is for him to remember us. That's what he did. If we don't do those things, I'll tell you what we're doing. We're rejecting him, rejecting his kingship, rejecting his kingdom, rejecting his hope, and railing against him and putting ourselves above him. That's what the other thief did. What are we going to do with this one who gave up all the glories in heaven, came to this earth, delivered to us the grace of God in the teaching that instructs us to deny ungodliness, to deny worldly desires, and to live righteously and godly in the present age so that we can be in fellowship with God and have hope after death. Listen, both of those robbers died. Both of them died. Only one of them got to be with the Lord in paradise. We have the same choice to make ourselves. Which one am I? And where do I truly fit in that story? That's the question. That's the thing to be learned. If you're here and you realize that you are going to be justly condemned by God because of your unrighteousness and your ungodliness, and that the only thing that you have to do is to plead the blood of Christ and ask for him to remember you on that day. If you're ready to, by faith, make the transition, put your hope and confidence in him and his will and follow him, we stand ready to help you in any way in which we